Hi, I'm Kyle on the Secure UX team, and today we're looking at license compliance, which is owned by the Secure subgroup, Software Composition Analysis. We'll be looking at the historical context of this, what the problem is, and what we're doing to help customers. Let's start with the brief history about different perspectives and the evolution of open source software. In June 1975, a group of computer and technology enthusiasts were at the Hyatt in Palo Alto for a demo of the Altair computer with a new version of BASIC program, which was created by Bill Gates and Paul Allen. One of the attendees made copies of the punch tape, which was a paper roll storage at the time, for the program. So the attendee that made the copy was a member of the Homebrew Computer Club, which was a group of hackers, hobbyists, and technology enthusiasts in the area founded in early 1970s. So when he made the copy of the program, they also made it available at the next Homebrew Club meeting, and in fact it was quite a few copies in a bucket for attendees to grab. And so again, the program was copied and distributed freely. After hearing about the copies and distribution, a very young Bill Gates, who again wrote the program with others, wrote an open letter to hobbyists to share his perspective about that, which was also published in the later monthly letter of the Homebrew Computer Club, and he wasn't terribly happy, to say the least. So the audience of this letter, the hobbyists that he's writing, really you have to understand their perspective is a hacker ethos among them of software should be free, period. We'll take a closer look at that in a moment, but overall, the letter outlined how much time and effort and money went into improving the basic version. There's a stated figure of 40,000. If you're really interested, there's a interesting backstory around that for another day, whether or not it's a bit debatable about that sum. It highlighted that most users never bought the program, noting that 10% of Altair owners had it without royalties, stated that just as hardware is paid for, so should software. And it questioned how anyone could afford doing this work professionally for no money. It asked people to send payment for repayment, and as it turned out, not many did that. So a few takeaways, and of course it's easy in retrospect to look at this, but one has to wonder if the wide copying of the program didn't help position the company. As computer makers defaulted to this version and subsequent versions and kind of became what we know as the default at the time. So would this have been the case without the free copying and distribution? So that is the advancement of technology? Who knows, but it's just a question that this brings to mind. On the other hand, expecting payment for software may have contributed to really opening up a new industry. So this letter was certainly prescient in a lot of different ways, and it just gives you a glimpse of the different perspectives at the time. Surely they've changed since. Let's look at the other perspective around that time, which was the free software movement. One of the leaders of this movement is Richard Stallman. He's a fierce advocate for open source free software. And here are a few quotes taken from a 1985 manifesto to get an idea of his view. He says, "The golden rule requires that if I like a program, I must share it with other people who like it. Software sellers want to divide the users and conquer them, making each user agree not to share with others. When we call software free, we mean that it respects the user's essential freedoms, the freedom to run it, to study, to change it, to redistribute copies and without changes. Once GNU is written, everyone will be able to obtain good system software just like Air. So GNU is it's the open source operating system he was working on at the time, and it's an acronym for GNU not Unix, which Unix was created in Bell Labs. So he and a friend, relevant to this conversation about license compliance, he and a friend coined the term copyleft for this, which is the reverse of copyright, meaning that everyone has permission to run, copy, modify, and distribute the versions. So this was very much predicated on his view of free software and that it should be free for all. And one of the challenges with building out the GNU was the need for the kernel at the time. And this was eventually contributed by young Linus Torvalds, by the way, who's the author of Git, as we know him today, and this became the Linux kernel. Today we see that a new perspective had evolved over this time that really merges open source and proprietary software, and GitLab's a great example of that as its so-called open core model. Okay, so what does this mean for us today in terms of licensing and license compliance? And well, first let's just take a look at what is a license. It's a permission to possess software property in our license context, of course. It's a grant of authority to undertake an activity, and there are obligations that come along with this grant of permission. For example, it's like a ticket to a free event. You can accept the ticket, which allows you access. It grants you that permission to come to the event, but the fine print on the backside might state that you're not allowed to take pictures, for example. And if you do, you'll lose your ticket. So if someone sees you taking pictures, they have the right to take the ticket away from you, and you can't be at the event. It's the same with open source software. You're free to use it in alignment with the stated license obligations. A notable distinction is a license isn't usually a contract. It's easy to get them confused, but a contract is an exchange of promises. Consider that in a contract, once you have predetermined agreements, you cannot revoke the rights to the other party. That would be a breach of contract. So there's just a small distinction to be made there, but it gets even more nuanced and more on the legal side in some cases because licenses sort of can become contracts. And for example, in the case where there's end-user license agreements. So, but that's a kind of outside of this about open source licenses, but a notable distinction. So what then exactly makes code open source? Based on the following guidelines of the Open Source Initiative, to be considered, the following must be met. So I'll highlight a few of them. First, it's just the free distribution. That's clearly, you're free to use the software, but the license must be obliged by that. The third one is derived work. This means that it can't just be like open source readable, but it also needs to allow for modifications. The fourth is integrity of the author's source code. So this is the ability to trace code to specific authors per modifications, and it must be public. So we see this, facilitators of this is places like GitHub and GitLab, which has this facilitated in public repositories. Jumping to 8, must not be specific to a product. One has the right to own the program, but it must not depend on other specific products. For example, requiring a person to purchase proprietary software to then have access. So these 10 guidelines, once these are met, the creator may assign a license. Common ones are MIT, Apache, BSD. As long as everything's aligning to these guidelines, that is indeed open source software. Again, each license, though, that you apply to it has varying different obligations and restrictions that must be met. So how are we helping organizations with license compliance? Looking at the job to be done for the person accountable for compliance, so that could be the legal department or the compliance department. For smaller companies, it may fall under the development department. But the problem the user is solving is ensuring that company policies with the license are enforced. For example, here at GitLab, we forbid the use of GPL version 123, OSL, for example, just to name a few. In this view, at the project level, the user may assign the policies to a related license. I want to highlight that this is done at the project level, highlighting that again. That's where we're at currently. And that license scanning configuration is a prerequisite for the policies and corresponding actions to take effect. License scanning will provide results and will soon match them against the policies. So this will bring attention to licenses that are out of compliance. That's what we see here on the screen. We see ones that are detected in project, and then at the top of the table, we see ones that have policy violations. This view and this matching of detected in projects versus policies that are assigned is scheduled for release in 12.10. Additionally, having a list like this of just simply ones that are detected in there is great for auditing purposes for companies and organizations. Auditing purposes, it surfaces the licenses. They're clickable to see the obligations, so that will be stated to make sure that companies are in accordance of the license obligations, and also to share it with their customers as well, because they have the right to, for SaaS customers, has the right to request that list. Okay, so for the user that is responsible for compliance, that being the developer, the ones introducing licenses and dependencies, as a new license is committed or a dependency that has a new license, the results will be shown once the scan job is complete in the pipeline in the merge request. This will be shown in the merge request. In cases that the user committed an out of compliance denied license in accordance with a project's policies, the merge request will be disallowed. This is scheduled for release in a 13.0 release. So I want to highlight our next steps on the team. Based on where our current feature maturity is, here are the following UX-related problems that we're focused on. The feature, as I mentioned earlier, is only at the project level. So that means that there are compliance loopholes since the maintainers can override policies and out-of-compliance merge requests. Compliance needs to apply to all users. Setting up the feature per license scanning configuration and applying related policies is a burden for large customers, as they would need to go individually to each project one by one and to do the configuration and adding policies. And then adding conditional policies isn't available and or easy, such as specifying one version is allowed or another version of the same license. So that's something we want to improve as well. Right now, there's a ongoing problem validation to look at these issues with the focus of a group and instance level, UX research to talk to customers to help guide our direction a little bit more, and as always, looking at identifying dogfooding opportunities. In the interim, we have a few introduction group level UX issues that we can get out there sort of as a common denominator, no matter what direction we go in terms of group and instance. There's a few things we can still help the users with, and that's showing project configuration status across projects at the group level. This gives customers a bird's eye view of where license scanning exists, and it's a starting point for the feature given its current maturity. And displaying when policy violations are made, so those earlier merge requests that we showed that will become disallowed because of an out of compliance, we can surface those up to the compliance, which has an MVC of showing out of compliance. So it's in alignment with what's the list that's seen on the compliance dashboard as it is. Okay, so that concludes the presentation. Thank you so much for watching, and please reach out to the Secure and UX team with any thoughts or questions. Thank you.